be an emissary, an envoy, an ambassador from God. And he is writing to the church of Corinth, and they are a people who are made holy by Jesus. And not only that, they are called to be holy. And so Paul has a purpose to be this apostle, this emissary. The people that Paul is writing to, they have a purpose to be holy, to be set apart for God's special use. So no matter who you are, they're really in the same boat. They are all dedicated to be for God's special purpose and special use, to glorify and to glorify God and to help expand that kingdom. Paul gives thanks concerning them. He gives thanks that God has made them rich in word and knowledge. And I think this is going to play a little later in the letter, but the idea that God is the one who has enriched them. God is the one who has made them wealthy in these blessings that have been bestowed upon it. So it's not as if they scratched out this spiritual living for themselves and they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, but yet it is God who has made them rich. And he made them rich in word and in knowledge. So we're not just talking about physical riches, but yet the spiritual riches, the kind of thing that helps us to maintain our spiritual life and maintain that membership that we have in the kingdom. And that we're not lacking in that. God gives us everything that we need. And he tells them that they lack no gift of grace given by God. And so that gift of grace, these spiritual riches that are given to us, isn't so that we can brag about them. It's not so that we can set ourselves above other people. But those spiritual gifts are given so that we can endure the challenges and hardships of life to make it all the way to the end, all the way to the completion of everything, all the way until Christ's return. You know, whether we're there physically for Christ's return or we pass away before then, either way we finish the race that we have been set. And so these gifts have been given for a purpose. Again, not just so that we can brag about it or set ourselves apart, but so that we might benefit from the gift that has been given to us by God. Then I think Paul gets into the meat of the letter. And the main problem that this congregation suffers from. And Paul encourages this Corinthian church to speak the same thing. And again, we said that speaking the same thing isn't that they agree on every single topic. It's not that they all say exactly the same thing word for word for word. Like if you ask about what is the nature of the Holy Spirit, their eyes just glaze over and they recite the same exact words. But yet these people are in agreement that they are part of the same kingdom and they act like that they're in the same kingdom. And so they look past whatever differences of opinion that they have and operate in a way that they are trying to advance the same goals and the same purpose that God has set before us. And so no bickering and things, not to get ahead of myself. And so there's this idea of these no divisions to be in the church. And so things like belief, things like status, things like opinion, all of those things can serve to kind of tear us apart in the church. And the word, like we talked about last week, was schisma. And it literally means a rip or a tear. And so that this fabric of fellowship should not be ripped apart. And so those divisions cause that. But Paul wants to encourage them to be a people that are sort of mended together in the same mind and judgment. And I don't know if I brought this out last week or not, but I think it's important to say that the idea that Paul is saying there in the previous section we discussed, that the idea of these people being mended together, it implies that sometimes in fellowship and in the times that we're together, sometimes there are rips and tears, even among the best of us. And so when Paul is encouraging them to speak the same thing, he's not saying that if your congregation ever comes to a point where there is a tear, you've just blown it and you should just give up. But the idea is saying you should be ones that have mended together, with the idea that there are going to be times, no matter how good you are, that these rips occur. But you should strive to try to mend those fences or to mend that fabric back together. And so we're not going to be perfect, and God isn't expecting us to be absolutely perfect. But what he does expect is that when we end up in those situations, we act in a godly way and we try to repair those things rather than just finalizing the tear. You go your way, I go my way, and we're never going to talk again. We shouldn't do that, but we should try to mend those fences. And so that's, like I say, one of the main ideas of the letter. And all the different topics that we talk about I think, can be simmered down into people getting into one camp versus another camp. And we're going to talk about one of those today, but there are all of these different ones. And there are, the haves and the have-nots, the people who have this tradition, the people who have that tradition, the people who have this spiritual gift, the people who have that spiritual gift. This idea of divisions manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And as we go through this letter, we may find that in our congregation or in our spiritual life, we may not be challenged with the same exact scenarios, but we may be challenged with the idea of divisions in the church and having to find a way to find common ground and to mend those divisions. Yes?
You hear a lot of churches splitting.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear very many churches combining together.
Right, that's a great point. We hear a lot about churches splitting. We don't hear a lot of them combining together. There are some, yeah, but we don't read a whole lot about, they had this big argument and this big fight, and they all buried the hatchet and got back together. There may be churches that come together because their membership is down, and they decide, well, we're just going to come back together for, share resources and all of that, but not a whole lot where people had this drop-dead argument, and they decided, you know what, that was silly. We need to get past that and be just the Lord's church without a wall in between us. Yes?
Well, right before that, it talks about but that you be perfectly joined together.
Right.
Many times in Scripture, perfect means mature.
Right. And that word, I don't know what translation that's in, but that word perfectly, I don't think is in there. But the idea of that word, and I forget what the exact word was, but it's the idea of kind of knitting something together, like a piece of fabric, or I think the general term was like to fashion something to completeness. So like taking a suit of armor and making sure it has all of the correct bits and pieces to it, that it's all kind of, strapped on just right, and that it's fitted perfectly to that person. And so I think that's where that translation gets the idea of perfect there, that it's perfectly fitted together. And so think of a garment that has no rips and tears in it again, a piece of armor that's perfectly tailored to the individual it's supposed to be worn by. Any other thoughts before we just jump into the text today? Okay, so I think that's our idea here. So if we take anything as we go through this whole letter, is that there are divisions in this church, and those divisions need to be done away with. And we're going to see a practical example of that starting today. So verse 11, "For it was declared to me by those of Chloe concerning you, my brothers, that there are quarrels among you. Then I say this, that each of you says, Indeed, I am of Paul, but I am of Apollos, but I am of Cephas, but I am of Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul not crucified on behalf of you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" And so here's sort of the crux of the matter, that there are these sort of quarrels among them. And so again, this practical example, Paul's not just generally saying, oh, there shouldn't be divisions of you. There are divisions in this congregation that Paul's writing about, and it was reported to him. And so it was declared to him from some people that come from Chloe, or they're of Chloe. You could read that in either way, whether they are of Chloe, like they're of her household, like they're her kids or people that work for her, or you could read that in that they have come from Chloe and they're giving this report. Both of those would be adequate translations here. But the idea here is that the emphasis is that this was declared to me concerning you guys. And so Paul's not just writing academically. Paul is writing about a specific set of circumstances from people who are trying to live and work within that congregation. So it's not hearsay, it's not just an idea, it's not a rumor. It is an actual report from people within that congregation. And that report is that there are quarrels among you. And that word for quarrels is the word eris in Greek. And what that word means is strife, contention, rivalry, dispute. And I think that idea of rivalry is one of those things that's a common thread throughout here, is that each person was sort of trying to outdo one another in some way. Rather than saying, we're in this one common family, we're in this one common kingdom, let's work together, they were all trying to pick out their differences, however minute they were, and say, well, I'm a little bit better than you in this. No, well, I'm actually better than you in this. And they were just sort of tearing themselves apart with these rivalries. Everybody wanted to be best. Everybody wanted wanted to have that little gold star next to their name in the church directory at Corinth, basically. And so all of these people had these rivalries, these disputes, these contentions with one another. In Greek mythology, they loved to do this. You took these qualities like this, and Eris as a quality was personified in the goddess of Eris. And that goddess was the personification of discord, and that discord often excited people to war. And so you have this idea that people took these tiny little differences among them, and they just bickered about it and bickered about it and bickered about it until it snowballed, until it turned into this huge war over something that was really nothing. And so it was reported that these disputes were among them. And so remember that Paul just encouraged them to be of the same word, that there be no divisions. But right off the bat, right in the first chapter here, Paul's already talking about a situation where this congregation is doing exactly the opposite of what he wanted to encourage them to be. And so I think that's why he had that encouragement at first, because then it kind of just pulls the rug out from under him. But I've heard from a valid report that you guys are doing exactly the opposite of what I would really like you to be. Any thoughts before we dive into this further? Yes? Uh-huh.
I've seen people hesitate,
Mm-hmm.
say something is not right,
Mm-hmm.
discord or a problem with people,
Right.
because they don't want to gossip
Right.
and things. But in this case, looking at, looks like the household of Chloe was trying to find a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So they went to someone who could help affect change.
Right. That's a good point.
And that's not gossip when you're trying to do it, when you're trying to find someone who can help solve the issue.
That's a great point.
Just chatter among people.
Right.
I think that speaks well of the household of Chloe, that they were doing it
Mm-hmm.
with the right intention.
Right.
Just to spread news, or not to tattle, but
Mm-hmm.
actually get someone who can help them resolve the problem. And I think that's a real hurdle, because no one wants to say anything
Right.
because they're afraid people might think bad of them.
Right.
You're really just trying to help solve the problem.
Right, exactly. And, we don't know any more background about it than this, but I think we can assume that those people tried to do the best that they could to mend those fences, and only after not being able to solve any of those problems, they went to another authority to try to maybe solve that dispute. But again, not to try to, let's see if we can get Paul on our side and put those people in their place. They really wanted to fix the problems in that congregation. I agree. And sometimes we are heavy-handed against those solutions. We don't want gossipers. We don't want those tattletales and such. And we use a very, big sledgehammer to try to fix that problem. And sometimes we're tempted to say, well, you should never tattle on anyone. You should never go complain about anything. You should never, try to affect any kind of change and just let people be. But that's not right either. And so there is a time, you're right, there is a time in which those things need to be fixed, and we need to appeal to an authority, whether it be like an elder or something like that. And that's not just complaining for the sake of complaining. You're trying to bring a problem to somebody's attention to try to affect positive change. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? Okay, so moving along. So then I say this, that each of you says, indeed I am of Paul, but I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I am of Christ. And so you had all of these different factions, some people who were claiming, well, I'm on Paul's team. I'm a Paul kind of Christian. Well, I'm an Apollos kind of Christian. And remember, Apollos was the preacher who went to Corinth from Ephesus. And so evidently he was a really good speaker. And so there were some people who were saying, well, I'm in the Apollos camp. And other people were even saying that I'm of the Peter camp, or I'm the Cephas camp. And there are some people who are saying, well, I'm just of Christ, and trying to not use Christ as this unifier of everyone, but trying to say, well, I'm actually in the Christ team as a means to divide them from the other groups. And I think we can look at this today, and we can kind of look about like denominations today. And people kind of they want to hyphenate their Christianity. They want to hyphenate the way that they follow Christ. It's not enough just to say that you're a Christian, but maybe I'm a Catholic Christian, or I'm a Lutheran Christian, or I'm a Methodist Christian, or a Baptist Christian. And sometimes, unfortunately, we can treat the name we put on our side. I'm a Church of Christ Christian, rather than just using it in its own sense, just to say that we come from Christ, but hyphenating our name in that. And so that's something that we need to be mindful of today. Are we dividing this kingdom of Christ? Are we dividing under some denomination or something? And that's not what we should do. And in fact, that's one of the goals of the early Restoration movement, was to try to mend all of that we should be nothing more, nothing less than just Christians. And so that unity was something that was very, very important. We also see disputes between congregations. That's something that we even see, that people, well, I'm of this movement. I'm a no kitchen group. I'm a one cup group. I'm a no supporting of Bible programs outside of this congregation group. And we find ways to erect these fences between ourselves, between even congregations of the Lord's church. We can set up these different things, and we can say, I am of this cause, or I am of that cause. We can also look at this between factions, between different between members of a single congregation. And so, there are people who would say, well, I'm of the team that I think that this group of people in the church is the right one. I think that group, maybe two people are quarreling with one another. Someone let the door slam in their face by accident, and they got mad about it, and I'm going to be on their team. I'm going to be on this other people's team. Or maybe I support this one program within the congregation, and someone supports another one. I think benevolence is most important. Well, I think that Bible class is the most important. And I think fellowship is the most important. And we can divide ourselves among that. So we can have divisions and factions and so many different facets. Here, I think we have the division is based upon the who you're following. And we can kind of have some of that. Someone might talk to you and brag, well, this person baptized me. This big name within the church, that's the person who baptized me. That means that I'm a Christian with a gold star next to their name. I'm really, really good because this stellar person dunked me in some water in a baptistry. And so we can have ways of dividing ourselves. And this was a big problem in the early church. In the 4th century, this was such a big problem, as who was the person that baptized you? Who was the person that convinced you to follow Christ? That it was so important that there were people in North Africa, when North Africa was again sort of subdued by Rome, that the Christians there, some of them, the big names in Christianity, they caved in and they renounced their faith. And so it was like, you either renounce your faith or you die. And so some of the big leaders within this church in Carthage, they said, well, I don't want to die, so I'm just going to publicly renounce my faith. I'll just repent of that later, no big deal, but I'm going to publicly renounce my faith so that I can survive, that I won't be tortured and killed. And so what some people in the early church said that, well, if one of those people, one of those leaders baptized you and they recanted, well, that means that you have to be rebaptized. And so that was a big thing in the church in the 4th century that the church had to struggle with and answer. And so there was one group saying, well, if somebody baptized you and they make a mistake and they fall out of the faith, you have to be rebaptized. And then another group says, well, actually, your faith is your own. It doesn't matter who baptized you. You still have that faith. You don't need to be rebaptized. And that's the team that ultimately won. But it was a struggle. And that struggle is based upon, how important is it the person that brought you into the faith? How important is the person that baptized you? And that same exact struggle, I think, we have in the Church of Corinth. Who do you belong to? Again, it's just a way of erecting a wall between you and other people of faith. Any thoughts there before I continue? Yeah. 2,000 years ago, right. Absolutely. It is about ego. Because, we're all, kind of in the same boat. We've all been, saved by the blood of Christ. But yet as people, we kind of want to be special, don't we? And we do that in so many ways in our lives. We do it with the houses that we live in, the cars that we drive, the clothes that we wear, the haircuts that we get, everything. And so it's natural that people want to do that in their faith too, because of, like you say, ego. We want to stand out among the crowd. And I think this church, people in this church were trying to say, well, I was baptized baptized by Paul. Well, I'm a Paul Christian. I'm on this team. I'm on that team. And their ego wanted them just to be a little bit better than the person sitting next to them. Absolutely.
Even in the church, we have splits because they follow the preacher.
Right. I mean, that's a common thing. People follow the preacher. That's exactly what they're dealing with here. That's a good way of putting it. And so Paul's answer to that, or the rhetorical questions that he asks here, has Christ been divided? Has Christ been split up? I mean, Christ is still one body, isn't he? And so the answer to that question is an obvious no. And so if Christ isn't divided, well, then what business do we have dividing ourselves? And so we serve one Savior, one head of the church. And so if that's the case, then we shouldn't divide ourselves. Was Paul crucified for you? And so again, the obvious answer to that rhetorical question is no. So if Paul isn't the one who affected our salvation, then, or anybody else, then why should we put anybody else on a pedestal besides Christ himself, besides the very one who was worthy of and affected our very salvation? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? And so to put a slightly different spin on that, did Paul have the authority, did Paul have the authority in which to baptize somebody? Like in the sense, like you're baptized for the forgiveness of sin because of the authority that Paul has, as if Paul could forgive sins, and he can't. And so Paul didn't make that sacrifice, and Paul didn't have the authority to make that sacrifice. So who's Paul then? What big deal is Paul? And so why would you want to be of the faction of Paul? And so the idea is that there is, just one faith and one faith in Jesus Christ, and that's it. Why divide yourself on any other personality, preacher, teacher, leader, anybody, and just be united in one Savior? And so, again, no divisions among us. We all say the same thing. Any other thoughts before we continue? Okay. So, moving along. And so because of this, Paul then continues on to say, I give thanks to God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. Now I also baptized the house of Stephanas. As to the rest, I do not know if I baptized any other. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to deliver the gospel, not by the wisdom of discourse, so that the cross of Christ may not be emptied. So Paul says, I give thanks that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. Now, I don't think that this is an attack on the character of the church. He's not saying, I'm thankful that I didn't baptize any of y'all except for these two, because all of y'all are not worthy of baptism. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that he's thankful that nobody could use that as a point of pride. That Paul is thankful that he didn't baptize anyone so that more people couldn't say, well, I was baptized by Paul himself. I'm a better Christian than you. That's the point here. And so Paul is thankful that that point couldn't be used as a source of division. Okay? And so that's one half of that equation. Then the other half, verse 16, now I also baptized the house of Stephanas. As to the rest, I do not know if I baptized any other. The point here isn't that Paul's kind of like forgetful about, I don't even know who I baptized. But the point here is that even Paul himself doesn't see the people that he baptized as being any more or less special than anyone baptized by anyone other than him. It's like Paul wasn't keeping a record of, I baptized this person, I baptized that person, and those people are extra special Christians, and everybody else, they're okay. Paul doesn't even know for sure who all he baptized. And so it doesn't stand out on his mind because it's not important. It's not an important distinction. And so that's the point. So it's not as if, he's forgetful. It's just he's making a point that there's nothing worth keeping track of. Then he says in verse 17, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to deliver the gospel, or to evangelize is the word there. And so there are some who take this as an argument against baptism. And if we look at the greater context here, that's not the point of what Paul is saying. Paul isn't saying baptism isn't important at all, but he's saying that my purpose isn't to baptize. My purpose is to deliver the gospel. The goal that I want to accomplish is to deliver the gospel to as many as possible, to cultivate that faith in as many as possible, not just to dunk people in water in my name and to score up, points within the church. And so his goal is to just deliver the gospel to people. And so it doesn't mean that baptism isn't important. It just means that we need to deliver the gospel. And our purpose isn't to find people off the street and dunk them in this baptistry up here. Because if we don't deliver the gospel to them, dunking them in that water is completely pointless. We're just getting them wet. If they don't know why they're doing it, if they haven't cultivated the faith into the why that they're doing that, then it's a pointless exercise. And so it's not just trying to rack up these points and how many people can I dunk in water myself and differentiate myself from other Christians. The point is, how can we share this gospel with as many people as we possibly can? And in the hopes that that would cultivate a faith, and then they could do something like that. And so that's an eventuality. The baptism is an eventuality in that. It's just not our first goal. And so, yeah, he was sent to baptize, but to not deliver the gospel. And so when he delivered this gospel, he didn't deliver it by the wisdom of discourse so that the cross of Christ may not be emptied. And so when Paul delivered the gospel, it wasn't that the people that were baptized or the people that did cultivate a faith, it's not as if they did so because Paul was just such an amazingly good speaker, that Paul just sort of talked them into it because he was just so slick with his words. And he's saying that it couldn't be that case because that would have emptied the cross, that he would have put his own ability and his own power and his own effort above that of Christ himself. And he would have effectively taken Christ off of the cross and emptied the cross and kind of put himself at the center of this equation of faith. And so it wasn't as if Paul was just this wonderfully persuasive and eloquent speaker. It was just that he spoke the truth and these people had faith in it. And so again, Paul is trying to take that emphasis away from himself and to put it back where it belongs, on God and on Jesus and on Christ. And so that power of the cross isn't emptied out. Any other thoughts there? Yes.
Going through life, we've had a lot of tent meetings and those type of gospel
Right.
meetings. You hardly ever see the gospel preacher baptize one of the local.
Right. I see. But I'm glad you bring up the preacher again, because that kind of goes back into that, people following the preacher around. I think it was your brother that said that. But that kind of goes into it, though, that there are people who are better speakers than others. There are people that come to places, tent meetings and such, not talking against tent meetings, but there are people that are such good speakers that people get caught up in that moment. They get caught up in the emotion. They get caught up in the persuasiveness of that individual, and therefore they go and they do something. And that can be dangerous. That can be very dangerous because they're following that individual. They're not necessarily following an actual faith. And so if they put too much stock in that person, then if that person falls, well, then they might think, well, I question everything that I ever believed in then. And they might fall away. Let me get to Daryl, then I'll get to you. Daryl. Preacheritis. Yeah, I guess that is what it is. Yes.
I think really verse 13 says it clearly. Was Paul crucified? Who was crucified? None of these preachers were crucified.
Right. Right, absolutely. That none of these preachers were crucified on their behalf. And they couldn't be. They weren't worthy of that. They weren't commanded of God to do that. And so it wouldn't have affected anything. And so when we work within God's kingdom, no matter who we are, we're not the center of attention. We work so that we can bring attention to Christ and to God, who should be the center of attention. So, yeah, we should strive to be as invisible as possible when we do that, when we work. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. Continuing on. For the word of the cross is indeed foolishness to those being destroyed, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved. For it has been written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and I will reject the intellect of the intellectuals. So, again, he just talks about, I came here to deliver the gospel, not to baptize. And I didn't deliver it with, these wise, eloquent, persuasive words. And so then he's kind of going on to the back of that and saying that the word of the cross is indeed foolishness. And so the idea that these aren't persuasive words, these aren't words of just logical proof. And so to people of the world, it seems foolish because we're asking people to just have faith in God. We're not saying because this mathematical formula X, Y, and Z, then therefore you have to have this conclusion that Jesus is the way. And I can prove this and have this logical proof, this mathematical proof. But there's this idea, this proclamation of a message that we trust in, that we believe in, that we have faith in. And so to the world, that's foolishness. Well, you didn't prove your case. There isn't something that can give me this definitive proof that I can hang my hat on. And so the world says that's crazy. And I should have put some examples of this, but actually some of them are profane, so maybe I shouldn't. But there's a lot of like ancient graffiti that makes fun of the faith. That's just saying, well, this is, silly, and making fun of Christians and all of that, Roman people. And so, that old world, that first century world was very critical of Christianity. It kind of scratched its head at Christianity. There were people in the Jewish world that said, well, you guys are just being tricked into this, and this is false. There were people in the Roman world and the Greek world that said, this doesn't make any intellectual sense. And those people were largely in control. Think of all of the cities that Paul delivered the gospel to, and he was run out of town by the Jewish people. He was stoned sometimes. He was, threatened sometimes, and he had to leave town. And so there were times in which, the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. They did sometimes crucify Christians, but they persecuted Christians. And so you have all of these groups that seemed like they were right, that they had it all figured out, that they were in power, that, they were the ones who were popular. And so they weren't necessarily right, though. They were foolish. They thought it was foolishness, but yet it says here in verse 18, the word of the cross is indeed foolishness to those being destroyed. And so it seemed like they were in control. It seemed like they were popular. It seemed like they were fashionable. But the reality was they weren't the ones in control. They were the ones who were being destroyed. They were the ones who were in the process of perishing. And so if you have to pick teams, do you want to be on the team of the side that's being destroyed, the side that's being defeated, or do you want to be on the side that's actually going to win? And so the other half of that, but it is power, it is the power of God to us who are being saved. And so to those who may be in the minority of the world, but yet have cast their hope and cast their faith upon God, that's power. The words of the cross, the gospel is power to us because those words cause us to build a faith, and that faith causes us to have action, and we get connected with the sacrifices that are given to us. And so it's therefore power to us, and that gives us that power to have salvation. Just like Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. And so those words is power. Even though the world thinks it's foolishness, the reality is that it's the power of God. Not the power within us, not the power in our intellect to believe those words, not the power in our ability to live a godly lifestyle, but it is the power that comes from God. And so it's not about us, it's about God giving us what we need in order to be saved. So it doesn't matter what the world thinks, it just matters what God does. And so the world can call everything that we do foolish. It doesn't matter because as long as it has the approval of God, it is powerful and it can't be defeated. Any other thoughts there before I continue? Okay, just want to give you guys a chance to chime in. Verse 19, and so to prove that, for it has been written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and I will reject the intellect of the intellectuals. And so this is an almost word-for-word quote from Isaiah 29:14, the Greek version, the Septuagint version of Isaiah 29:14. And that says, the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden. And so he will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones. He'll reject the intellect of those with intellect. And so anything that's built on a foundation of man, it's just nothing compared to God. It's no match for God. And so, it's always been true. This is something written hundreds of years prior by Isaiah, inspired by God. And so it is something that has always been true, that no intellect of man, no power of man, no authority of man has any match for God. And there have been times throughout history that mankind has tried to stack themselves against God, and every single time they've lost. And so this is something that has always been true. And so Paul includes that here, that the world can think all of this is foolish, and it can think that all of this is silly, but God is really, truly the one in control, despite what it sometimes looks like. Any other thoughts there? Yes?
There are countries, communist countries,
Mm-hmm.
that, let's face it, they think that God is not around.
Right.
There's no God, there's no Christ.
Right.
Just think of all the people that are not saved because of that.
Right. For sure. For sure. That there are a lot of people not saved because you have countries and powers that have outlawed that. But you can look at something like that, like say the Soviet Union. They took a lot of those churches and and they just basically turned them into warehouses sometimes. Very secular uses. And there was a very concerted effort in the Soviet Union to stamp out any religion or religious belief, because it was the antithesis of their political ideologies and beliefs. And so they thought it was just quaint and silly, and we're going to direct people to have devotion to the state, and anything else was a waste. And you can think of someone who ruled with an iron fist, like, say, Stalin, and did so for decades and decades, and this organized, concerted effort to stamp out religion. I'm not saying that everybody that Stalin killed was killed for religious beliefs, but Stalin killed millions upon millions of people. He killed people just because he suspected that they could defect against him in the future or speak against him in the future. And so he ruled with this iron fist. And so you have this concerted effort to destroy Christianity. But you look at Russia today, many faults, I'm not going to get into that, but yet they still have the Christian religion. And as soon as that's gone, that's back, that's there. And it didn't die, despite the best efforts of this person who ruled literally with an iron fist and exercised that authority and did everything in his power to destroy it, didn't destroy it. So the most powerful of people couldn't stamp out God's word even on his best day. And so I think that's what Paul is stressing here, is that the powers of this world don't compare at all against the power of God. So who are we going to put our trust in? And it might seem like this is out of line with what Paul's trying to argue here, but yet if we're dividing ourselves over these human personalities, over these preachers or apostles or teachers or whatever, these human people, if we're putting our faith in those individuals instead of God, then we're misplacing our faith. And so they may be good people. They may be people that are worthy of our respect. They may be people that are worthy of us to give some attention to. But we shouldn't put our faith in any human thing or human institution. So, any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? I speak too much sometimes. Sorry. I need to give you guys more of a chance. Okay. So with that in mind, continuing on, verse 20, where's the wise one? Where's the scribe? Where's the inquirer of this age? Did God not make foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through its wisdom, God was pleased to save the ones who believe through the foolishness of proclamation. So where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where's the inquirer of this age? So, where are the best of humanity, right? Where's the wise people of humanity? Where's the scribe? There weren't very many literate people in the first century. And so where's the person who could write down, and the scribes literally wrote down and copied the word of God, who wrote down the law. So they knew the law. So you have the wise one, which might be secular wisdom. You have the scribe, which might be religious wisdom. And then who's the inquirer of this age? The person who has the smarts to like who's the best, smartest, brightest person to ask the questions of the world around them. Pause for a second. If you are a regular Bible reader, if you could raise your hand. Thank you. So who are the best of the best among the world? Then it says, did God not make foolish the wisdom of the world? And so how does the best of us stack up against God? And we can look throughout the history of humanity that it doesn't. We just talked about Stalin just a second ago, but we can even look at examples in the Bible. I mean, think about what happened when mankind got together and said, you know what, we're going to get together, combine our intellect, combine our resources, we're going to build a tower, and we're going to stretch that tower up into the sky, and we're going to put ourselves on the same level as God. God didn't let that happen, did he? He confused that effort. How about Noah? Noah for, almost a century putting together and building this ark as the world, walked by him and saying, what are you even doing this for? Everything's going to go on just as it always has. Why would you do this? So Noah being one family, one man with one family throughout a whole world of people scoffing at him. Well, God took those people who thought that they were wise and made them know exactly how foolish they were, and they perished. How about someone like Pharaoh? I mean, think about how long ago that kingdom of Egypt was. We look at the pyramids today, and that would be an amazing feat for us to build a pyramid today. And that great pyramid, this is the craziest thing in my mind, is that you take from the pyramids to the time of Christ, and then from the time of Christ to us. Well, the time between Christ and the great pyramids of Egypt is longer than the time between Christ and us. That's how long ago those pyramids were built. And yet they're magnificent, they're amazing, they're powerful. And then, a few hundred years, almost 1,000 years after that, we have Israel being enslaved by that exact kingdom, by those exact people, the very people who built those amazing structures that thousands of years later are still being celebrated by us as a wonderful wonder of the world. But that country, that kingdom being, subjugated by the power of God, by, like the 10 plagues, this mighty nation was trying to say, we're better than God. We can keep these people. It doesn't matter. The one true God doesn't have any power. Our gods have power. But yet God showed them who was really in control. They thought they were wise, but it made them to be foolish. Look at Rome. Rome tried to stamp out, Christianity, persecuted Christians by the thousands, made sport of them, put them in their colosseums and made sport of their public executions. But what ended up happening to the Roman Empire? It just a few hundred years after, it adopted Christianity as its official religion. Now, that's problematic in of itself, but that's another discussion. But yet, the very people that they had the power to destroy literally conquered them without firing a single shot. And so God's will and God's power outmatches that of the world any day of the week. So since in God's wisdom, the world did not know God through its wisdom. And so, again, we don't have the ability to figure out God's plan on our own. Like without any help, without any shared wisdom from God, we can't come to the correct conclusion on our own. I think we can look at Romans 1 for that. If we use our own intellect to try to be righteous, we're going to fail every time. And Romans 1 outlines that, and that the situation gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And so if we could, then it would depend on our own effort. And so we couldn't figure it out through our own wisdom. Sorry, you had a comment. I hope I didn't go too far. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. I see. Mm-hmm. Right. Inadvertently they were. And so, finishing up here with verse 21, just so we can conclude with that, that the world has no ability to find God through its own wisdom. But yet God was pleased to save the ones who believe through the foolishness of proclamation. And we might pick up on this next week because I want to pull up a few threads from this. But God was pleased to save the ones who believe. So God, rather than having us do it for ourselves with our own grit, with our own intellect, with our own determination, for our own power, God was pleased. God was happy to give us another way. God was happy to share his power with us and to make us strong through his strength. And that connection that we have with that power is that the ones who believe, and that what that literally means is the ones who have faith. And so if we have faith in God, we can be connected to that power that God is pleased to save us with. And that is through the foolishness of proclamation. So not through wisdom, not through intellect, not through proof, but through proclamation, through yelling something out like a town crier and just shouting out the truth and having a faith in that truth, rather than a sign, rather than a symbol, rather than logic, just hearing somebody proclaim it. And that word is elsewhere translated as preach, but I think proclamation is the real sense of that word. And I'm going to let you hang on to that thought for a week, and I will discuss that next week, Lord willing. But yet, I think the thing that we can take away from this today is that the world may seem like it's in control sometimes, and it may seem to get us down sometimes. And there may be plenty of people in this world that says that we're just some quaint superstition and everything. The world's been doing that for thousands of years. And just because we might feel like the minority sometimes in the world, that doesn't mean God is not in control. It doesn't mean that we're part of this hopeless, lost cause. We are on the winning side. And we have put our faith in the right thing. And we just need to keep our head down and to still be proud to wear God's name and still try to show the world love so that as many other people can also benefit from that same love that we have also benefited from. And so even though it sometimes seems that God is in control, he really is. And that shouldn't embitter us. That shouldn't make us fearful or anything. We should just continue the course. With that, we will conclude for today, and I thank you for your attention and your comments, and Lord willing, we'll pick up in the next verse next week. Thank you so much.